Hi, I'm Rebecca Gottesman. I'm the chief of the stroke branch at the NINDS Intramural Research Program. And I'm talking to you today about a new scientific statement, the impact of sleep disorders and disturbed sleep on brain health. This is a really important paper, we believe, and I really want to thank the AHA for commissioning this on behalf of my writing group. We wanted to do this paper because really this topic hasn't been addressed by the AHA before. So the AHA has thought about the importance of sleep, and certainly everyone that reads a paper, everyone that thinks about their health thinks about sleep because it's such an important part of our everyday. But the AHA has only addressed sleep regarding cardiovascular health more broadly. But there's really increasing evidence that sleep and disturbances in sleep and disorders in sleep are really important for brain health more broadly. So when I'm talking about brain health, I mean anything ranging from stroke to silent changes in the brain that look like strokes but might not cause stroke symptoms, to cognitive decline and dementia. So all those aspects of brain health may be very important when we think about sleep, disorders of sleep like sleep disordered breathing and obstructive sleep apnea, as well as disturbances of sleep. So this is really why we wanted to proceed with the scientific statement. In addition, sleep has really been identified in general as really important in health by the American Heart Association. So the AHA put out as part of their Life's Essential 8 that they felt that sleep and optimal sleep was really an important part of optimal cardiovascular health. So this is one indication that sleep is really something we need to be thinking about. In addition, the Lancet Commission, which presented information on preventing dementia and recommendations for how to modify risk for dementia, included sleep as an important modifiable risk factor for dementia. So taken together, we really thought this was an important time to address this topic. So first in the scientific statement, we talk a bit about what sleep is. So certainly we all know what we try to do when we have sleep, but there's different stages of sleep and they have different importance when we think about impacts on brain health. So in general, sleep plays an important role in the consolidation of memories. So you learn something during the day, you go to sleep, and the role of sleep is to help remember, to move those memories to different parts of the brain so you can really consolidate those memories. So because sleep plays an important role in the consolidation of memories, it follows that if you have problems with your sleep, whether there's disorders or disturbances in the quantity or quality of your sleep, those disturbances may lead to problems with your memory. We've really begun to understand more and more that these are not just day-to-day problems, that you might not remember something you learned during a day if you had a poor night's sleep, but might have long-term effects on your brain health. So when I talk about disorders and disturbances, I want to define a few things. The most common type of sleep disorder that we think about is sleep disordered breathing, and the most common type of sleep disordered breathing is obstructive sleep apnea. So sleep apnea, we know, is well studied, particularly regarding cardiovascular disease, and it really has a lot of different relationships with brain health, which we'll talk about shortly. In addition, there's other sleep disorders. Some people can have central sleep apnea, which can occur as a consequence of things like heart disease or heart failure, also with older age and sometimes after stroke. In addition, we think about sleep disturbances or problems with the quality of sleep. So some forms of these sleep disturbances can be circadian rhythm abnormalities, where people have problems with the regularity or timing of their sleep. Sometimes this is transient, sometimes it's more long-term. In addition, some people can have fragmentation of sleep, where they have frequent arousal, frequent awakening during sleep, insomnia with difficulty with sleep initiation, and even the amount of sleep that you get can be considered a disturbance of sleep. So too little or too much sleep can both affect brain health potentially. So what do we know about how these different types of sleep and sleep disorders and sleep disturbances affect brain health? So importantly, sleep apnea, as I mentioned, is a very common form of sleep disordered breathing. If people have a history of obstructive sleep apnea, they have about double the risk of having a stroke, and this is especially the case in men. So certainly an important risk factor for stroke, and it seems to be independent of other vascular risk factors, which often go along with sleep problems. In addition, stroke and the relationship between sleep and stroke is very interesting because there seems to be a circadian tendency for strokes to occur in the early morning hours. And this is actually something that we've monopolized on as stroke doctors, in that we can actually guess that people are more likely to have had a stroke in the early morning hours if they wake up with a stroke. So those people now are increasingly eligible for potential treatments for their stroke because of the likelihood that they might have had their stroke right before they woke up. There's testing we can do to help us understand that. In addition, people that have obstructive sleep apnea also have an increased risk of stroke-like changes in the brain, what we often call silent cerebrovascular disease. And silent, I'll put in quotes because really the accumulation of these changes over time can be problematic and can lead to problems with cognition and with memory and lead to dementia. But in general, people that have more obstructive sleep apnea and other sleep disorders have a higher risk of these silent changes in the brain. They look just like stroke on imaging, or they look related to stroke, but they're not necessarily causing symptoms the same way. In addition, sleep abnormalities are associated with an increased risk of dementia. Alzheimer's disease specifically, as well as dementia more broadly, with Alzheimer's being the leading cause of dementia. This is sometimes tricky to study because it turns out that people who have dementia may in turn develop problems with their sleep. So if we want to understand the relationship between the two, we really need to think about sleep problems that preceded Alzheimer's disease or dementia to understand if there's really a risk factor relationship there. In general, we also know that there are changes in sleep that occur as people get older. So obviously, stroke and dementia are diseases as people get older, but in addition, in the absence of those conditions, in the absence of abnormalities in brain health, sleep quality tends to get worse as people get older. People spend less time in REM sleep. They spend less time in slow wave sleep, which is an important part of sleep where often a lot of the memory consolidation occurs. In addition, their sleep is generally more fragmented, so more arousals, more frequent awakenings, which we think leads to some of the difficulty with memory over time. In addition, when we think about sleep disturbances potentially causing problems with brain health, we also need to consider that many people with abnormalities in their brain health may develop sleep problems. I already mentioned that people with dementia may have an increased risk of sleep apnea and other sleep disturbances. It also is the case that people who have strokes have a greater risk of sleep disturbances after their stroke. Not only that, but having a sleep disturbance after your stroke increases your risk of poor recovery after the stroke. So it's really important for us to understand the role of sleep and its alterations in the setting of stroke, as well as dementia and Alzheimer's disease. There's some exciting work being done in the stroke field, understanding the role of CPAP, which is continuous positive airway pressure and is a treatment for sleep apnea, the role of CPAP in people with stroke who have sleep apnea to understand if this can improve outcome. And the Sleep Smart study and the Rise Up study are two important places where that's being studied. I mentioned that sleep apnea is more common in people with Alzheimer's disease than who don't have it. And probably between a third and half of people with Alzheimer's disease dementia have obstructive sleep apnea. There is some evidence, although the data are inconsistent in different studies, but there's some evidence that the use of CPAP in people who have Alzheimer's disease and have severe sleep apnea may actually have slower cognitive decline. But we really still have a lot of work to do to understand that. So what are the mechanisms linking sleep, its disorders, and its disturbances with poor brain health? And this is really a big focus of the scientific statement. So in general, one thing to consider is that sleep disorders, such as obstructive sleep apnea, and stroke and dementia have some shared risk factors. So what this means is that hypertension, obesity, diabetes may be risk factors not only for stroke, cognitive decline, and dementia, but also for sleep problems. So we need to consider that when we're looking at associations between the two. In addition, however, they may be somewhere on the causal pathway. And what I mean by that is that sleep disturbances may lead to problems with vascular health, and those in turn may affect your risk of stroke or dementia. So one potential mechanism is simply that there's an increase in vascular risk factors, increase in their level, and that may contribute to the dementia and brain health problems. In addition, there's two other leading sets of hypotheses that I want to go over briefly here. One is the concept of synaptic homeostasis. So this idea is that in general, over the course of a day, people are learning all sorts of information. They're creating synapses or connections between neurons as they gain more information. And at night, part of our job during sleep is to sort of prune those, down-regulate those synapses so you don't have all of this upregulated synaptic activity. Too much neuronal activity, too much activity of the neurons continuing over time can lead to potential release of toxic proteins, even those that might lead to Alzheimer's disease. And so the idea is that we need this synaptic homeostasis to sort of settle things down, clean things up after a day of making new synapses and learning. Another really exciting hypothesis and mechanism linking sleep to brain health is the idea of the glymphatic system. So this is a concept that there's a system that is around the blood vessels in the brain, that has the idea to exchange cerebrospinal fluid with the interstitial fluid. And the idea is that it's cleaning up toxins. So it's really a waste removal system. And this is a relatively new concept that has been described in the past several years. And the idea is that if there's toxins in your brain, including harmful proteins that might accumulate and lead to something like Alzheimer's disease, and your lymphatic system is not able to clear them, perhaps that might contribute to the development of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. We think that most of the lymphatic function occurs during slow wave sleep, or what's called the N3 stage of non-REM sleep. Anything that therefore alters your amount of time you spend in non-REM sleep or your amount of time in slow wave sleep is probably potentially going to affect lymphatic system function. And that may explain why these sleep disturbances or fragmentations might lead to alterations in brain health and lead to worse outcomes. There's some other mechanisms that have been identified that are specific to certain types of adverse brain health. So for stroke in particular, it's possible that autoregulation of blood flow in your brain may be altered in the setting of sleep problems. There may be increased clotting abnormalities associated with sleep disturbances, and even increased pressure because of sleep apnea, because of sleep disordered breathing, might mean that there's an increased probability of a clot going from one side of the heart through a potential hole in the heart to the other side. So there are some specific mechanisms that are of interest as we think about linking sleep, its disorders, and its disturbances to brain health. So what about prevention and treatment? I think it's really important to emphasize, as I said at the very beginning, that sleep is a potentially modifiable risk factor for adverse brain health. When we think about prevention, there's those same vascular risk factors that I mentioned. If obesity is a very strong risk factor for sleep apnea, which it is, then potentially reducing obesity, preventing sleep apnea in the first place, could prevent some of these downstream sequelae. If stroke leads to a higher risk of sleep disordered breathing, which it seems to, then potentially preventing stroke could be important for these longer term outcomes as well. So we certainly need to think about prevention as we're thinking about potential ways to alter these relationships between sleep and abnormal brain health. What about treating sleep disorders? I mentioned a couple of examples, but in general, the concept of if you already have a sleep disorder or a sleep disturbance, can we treat that, get the problem to go away, and then brain health won't be affected? And there's, as I said, some evidence in Alzheimer's disease that treating sleep apnea might decrease the risk of cognitive decline, but the data are not consistent when we really need to understand more. In addition, there's these studies that I mentioned looking at stroke and seeing if treating sleep apnea will reduce the poor outcome that we see in stroke patients who have sleep apnea. So those are important studies that are ongoing, but in general, there's still a lot we need to learn about the potential role of treating sleep disorders. I do want to mention that people often think of other ways to treat sleep and disturb sleep. I mentioned that you can have problems with stroke, dementia risk, et cetera, associated with too much or too little sleep. And we do have evidence for some of that. So you might say, what about a sleep medication? Would that be sufficient to resolve that problem? And again, there's not a lot of evidence for this, but at least in one observational study, we've seen that sleep medications, if anything, actually increase the risk of dementia. And again, it's an observational study, so we can't read too much into that. But I think we need to understand much more about interventions on sleep and their disturbances and how those affect brain health. There are several treatments for sleep disturbances that we really don't understand how they might affect long-term sequelae, such as those on brain health. For example, we don't know how behavioral therapies used to treat insomnia might have an impact on brain health. We don't quite understand how things like melatonin might affect brain health in the long run, and really how just changing the amount of sleep someone gets might make a difference in these brain health outcomes. So the last section that we talk about in this statement, which I really want to emphasize, is the importance of disparities, racial ethnic disparities in sleep as well as in brain health. So in general, underrepresented groups have higher rates of stroke, higher rates of dementia, and cognitive decline. In addition, sleep disorders appear to be less likely to be diagnosed, less likely to be treated in minoritized groups. And certainly there's a lot of societal factors that can contribute to environmental changes that might lead to more sleep disturbances, noise pollution, light pollution, et cetera, in communities with more minoritized individuals. When we think of ways to intervene and we think about potential treatments and how they might work to reduce the effect of sleep on brain health, we really need to make sure these are scalable interventions that can be applied broadly in broad populations so that we can help as many people as possible. So what are the takeaways from the scientific statement? As we write in this statement, we think in general that we need to understand more the role of potential interventions to improve sleep and how these might affect brain health. In addition, we need to make sure we're doing this in diverse populations. In addition, the use of biomarkers can be very helpful, both to understand sleep and to measure different aspects of sleep and its health or lack of health, but also to study brain health. So we have biomarkers that might reflect both ends of that relationship. And really, those can help us understand mechanism as well as help us design studies. And then finally, we think that we understand some of the mechanisms linking sleep to brain health, but there's a lot of steps along the way that still aren't understood. We need to continue to work in this area. We need to continue to think about measuring sleep before the development of dementia to get away from this concept of what we call reverse causation, which is that the dementia might cause sleep disturbances. And we need to continue to evaluate sleep in other ongoing cardiovascular studies. Another recommendation that this group made as part of this writing group is that we consider sleep-dependent tasks as part of standard cognitive assessment in other types of cognitive evaluation in other studies. And certainly this is something that I think reflects the general need to think about sleep as we think about brain health more broadly, because it really is a potentially modifiable risk factor. And we think that this statement will start getting us in the direction towards doing more research in this area. On behalf of the writing group for this scientific statement, we really want to thank the AHA. Thank you for your interest in this topic, and we look forward to lots of exciting work in this area in the future.